so let me kind of give you a heads up of where we're headed. We're in the book of Micah. We're going to finish Micah next week, and then that first week of December, 2 weeks from today, we launch into the book of John. So we'll go from the minor prophets over back to the New Testament, and we're going to spend at least 6 months, maybe 8 months in the book of John. I mean, it's going to be almost chapter by chapter. It could be longer than that. So really going to meticulously go through the book of John. I'm so excited about that. We've taught on that on a number of occasions and love the book and love to be able to share and just learn from each other in terms of the book of John. But we're in Micah today. And you know, the minor prophets, and just kind of level set, there's a lot of commonality. I mean, these prophets were basically prophesying to they took the place of the judges, and so they were God's liaison, God's speakers to these kings for about 300 years. Really until when the kingdom split up, and you remember that happened after Solomon's son, Rehoboam, was it Rehoboam? Rehoboam. He's the one that was berserk, and they rebelled and they split the tribes. So 2 stayed, and Judah, the southern kingdom, and the rest, the other 10, went to the northern kingdom, Israel. And we talked a lot as we walked through 1st and 2nd Kings about it. The majority of it was focused on that northern kingdom, because as much out of line and as disobedient as both of them were, the northern kingdom was even more disobedient. They were more influenced by the nations surrounding them, Assyria in particular. So they took on a lot of the Assyrian practices, including child sacrifice, you know, all the things God had talked about in Leviticus. And by the way, you know, with Leviticus, has that always been a difficult book? I mean, that's not a hoot to read. And generally, if you get into a conversation or if you look at social media, when people will go after Christianity and Christian practices, they'll generally start with the book of Leviticus. Hey, look, here's these nut jobs, and here's this book that all it is 600 some odd laws. This is the God they're serving. Look how petulant and petty he is. And by the way, how many of those apply today? And let's start with the LGBTQ community, because here it's condemning it, but you know, look at all these other laws surrounding it, how crazy they are. So of course that one's crazy too. Well, the truth of the matter with the book of Leviticus was God didn't sit in the sky and go, let me just take some time and whittle off all these laws for no reason. Every single law that he laid out when he said, don't do this, he was taking it from a pagan nation surrounding them. And he was telling them, you know this is what they do, you don't do that. Now, he could have just simply shortened the book to a couple of verses and said, listen, all the surrounding nations, you know what they do, don't do that. But instead, he said, no, I'm going to spell out what they're doing. You're already familiar with it, but in case you're not, and you know, if you haven't encountered it yet, here's what we're looking at. You don't do this. You've been consecrated, you've been set apart, you've been made holy. So as a result, don't do what they're doing. I have selected you, I've pulled you out of slavery, and I've named you as my own, you're chosen. So the book of Leviticus is really talking about shaving half of your head or no tattoos or whatever. That's what these other countries were doing. So he's saying don't do that. And so then when Solomon dies and the 2 kingdoms split, here comes this 300 to 400 years of these prophets. Now we had Isaiah and Jeremiah in there too. They're called major prophets, but they're not major because they're more important, and the minors aren't minor because they're less important. It's all about the brevity of the book. These are short books, but it's the same powerful message. But it's a redundant message. And I'm just being candid when I say this. Lynn said, so we're still in Micah. I said, right. She said, is this any different than Hosea and Amos? And I said, not a lot. I said, it's very similar. You know, basically it's condemnation and justice and God judging especially the northern kingdom, and he keeps warning them. He keeps saying, you're doing this, stop doing it, stop it. And he starts to then tell them, with the prophets like Hosea and Micah in particular, this is what's going to happen if you continue. At first he was kind of not general. At first though, he was telling them, stop. But now he's saying, hey, let me prophesy and let me tell you exactly what's coming. And that's what you're going to see in this passage today. He had spent the better part of this book really telling them, hey, basically, you're going to be destroyed by Assyria. And when he's telling them this, they thought Assyria was their ally. They were actually paying Assyria off not to come and attack them. And Assyria was almost like a bully at school who takes your lunch money, was pretending to like them. And so they were getting things from Assyria, but they were also becoming more like Assyria. So there was a financial tie that felt like a commitment. And there were other things that made them feel like we need to be like these people. And God kept telling them, they're like a lion. They're going to come rip you to shreds. Don't be like them. Set yourself apart and stop paying them. I'm your protection. You don't need to pay them off in order for them to keep from attacking you. They're going to attack you, just like a bully in school takes you out after school one day and beats the living crap out of you. I mean, you think you're doing your thing, you give him the lunch money, and you think you're all good, but sooner or later he takes you out and whips you in the backyard. And that's what he's telling these folks. But nestled in the middle of this, as we get to the end of the book, all of a sudden God flips. And he starts to tell them the good things that are going to happen. And I'm going to pull you out, and I'm going to make a remnant. So these prophets are telling the northern kingdom, you're going to be destroyed. And they were destroyed, by the way, in 722. And he's also telling Jerusalem or Judah, you're going to be destroyed if you don't stop. And 200 years later, 150 years later, sure enough, Babylon comes in, sacks Jerusalem, and drags them all off into captivity. That's when Daniel and his friends got dragged off to Babylon. So that's what we're looking at. But we're going to see today we're going to see two passages. One is considered to be, other than Isaiah 53, which describes Messiah in great detail, or Psalm 22, which describes crucifixion in great detail before it even existed. This is the other third passage that they say is the most prophetic passage in the Old Testament concerning Jesus, because it's so spot on and so particular. And when you hear it and read it, you're almost like, well, yeah, duh. I mean, I don't see how we can't see if Messiah is not coming from what they've described. So Micah prophesied for about 50 years, really from about 740 to 690. And right in the middle of that, 722, sure enough, is when Assyria came and destroyed Samaria and the northern kingdom, scattered them all over the place. We've talked about this. That's when they started to intermingle, intermarry. And when they started coming back to Samaria, it was all half-breeds. And that's the reason in the New Testament the Jews hated Samaria. They would walk around it. They wouldn't go through it. And it's also the reason Jesus chose a Samaritan woman, two cases of Samaritans, a Samaritan woman at the well to show what true compassion looks like and living water. And then he also chose to use the parable of the gentleman who goes through Samaria and gets attacked. And here comes a priest and a rabbi. They don't do anything for him. And then a Samaritan comes. He's a Samaritan. I can't remember who.
The Good Samaritan.
Yeah, the Good Samaritan comes and takes care of him. And the people that were hearing this, the Jews were like, did you say this guy, that it was a good Samaritan? They couldn't believe that. So that's Samaria, and that's what happened to Samaria. So it's starting in verse 5, and I'll just kind of commentate on this a little bit. But by the way, this is interesting.
What chapter?
We're in chapter 5. Sorry, not verse 5. We're in Micah 5. Micah was a contemporary of Isaiah. And they prophesied at the same time. Micah was primarily in Israel. Isaiah was primarily in Israel, Judah.
Okay,
But they.
hang on. His blood sugar is elevated right now, so you're struggling a little bit. Like your eyes are really red. Are you going to have a cardiac event? Like, does anybody a nurse?
Yeah. Do we have a nurse in here?
No, I can just tell.
I do. I've got a little deck. I wear a little thing, and it's sky high right now. So yeah, I'm talking fast, but it's okay. I just took some glucose tablets, so I'll probably get slow. And by the time we're done, I'll probably be asleep. So just watch the progression.
Right.
That's right. Well, that's the reason I'm talking so fast. I'm hoping to. So he's a contemporary of Isaiah. What's really interesting is commentators say they were probably very good friends. And the reason they say that is because there's passages in Isaiah that are virtually identical verbiage to what's in Micah. So it's really interesting because it's not just talking about the same subjects. They're using the same kind of vernacular, which back then the Hebrew language was extensive. So it'd be really rare to kind of pick out the same words and then put them together in that same formation, which is what they did. But as I thought about this and I started to think about 9/11, what would happen with the Israelites or with Judah, God would warn them, and what they would do is they'd pump the brakes for a few years, meaning that they would actually get in line. They would start taking their idols down. They would start offering sacrifice again. The people would come out in mass and start worshiping. And then after a while, they just kind of went back to doing whatever they did. Does that sound like 9/11? You know, the 3 weeks or 4 weeks post 9/11, churches in America had the greatest attendance they've had in 50 years. And it took 4 weeks. And then the decline began to happen, and within 3 months, they were back to their pre-9/11 levels. And so what people looking back, not necessarily historians, but commentators have said is what people did was they grieved. They were grieving, and they went to church to grieve. But once they had finished the grieving process, or really kind of gotten it to a point that it was manageable, they're out. That's exactly what was happening in Scripture here. They were grieving because these things that God was saying were going to happen began to happen. So they would pump the brakes, just like 9/11, start to grieve, start to offer sacrifices, start to worship. And then they were like, and it's back to party time, just like we've done with this country. So my point is, we look at passages like this and we're like, well, that was thousands of years ago, and these guys are minor prophets. How does that apply to me? You know, well, how authentic is our worship each week? And does it get escalated, or does it rise and spike when something in our life is happening and where we really need God's help? But then when we kind of get where we're level again and things are good, we just go back to whatever we're doing. That's pretty normal. So this is what it says in chapter 5. He says, "Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek." Here's what that's talking about. It's basically saying, brace yourself, you're about to be under attack. And what we saw was when Assyria came in, so Sennacherib, who was the leader of Syria, when he came in, he actually, he was taking that financial tribute from Israel, and then he came in and slaughtered all of their children, most of their women, carried their men off in slavery, and burnt their city to the ground. So when it says a rod will strike them in the face, that's literally taken place. That's what's happened. Well, we know that when Babylon came in and destroyed Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar took, the king at the time was Zedekiah. He took his sons and paraded them in front of him and slaughtered his sons right in front of him. Made a ceremony out of it. I mean, wow, imagine that. And then he gouged his eyes out. Then they put a big ring through his nose, and they literally dragged him back to Babylon. So this is what it means to be struck with the rod. That's what he's talking about. But listen, here comes this prophetic passage that's considered, along with Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, to be the most spot-on description of Christ. "But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from days of old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor is given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord is God. And they shall dwell secure, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace." Now, who does that sound like? First of all, it calls out Bethlehem, and it even says, you're so tiny, you're not even recognized among the tribes of Judah. So if Jerusalem is here, just south of Jerusalem, and it's only 5 miles away. I don't know where I thought Bethlehem was, but I thought it was a long way away from Jerusalem. You stand on the east corner of Jerusalem, like at the corner overlooking the Blood Potter's Field, and you can see Bethlehem. And it looks like it's 3 miles away. It looks like it's right over the hill. But you can literally see Bethlehem standing up in some of the higher places in Jerusalem. But it's tiny. It's teeny tiny. Now people make pilgrimages, especially on Christmas Eve, and it's packed out. But it's so insignificant. So it'd be weird for someone to call that out and say, someone's coming from there. We already know David came from there, but someone's coming from there. And by the way, he shall be their peace. Jesus is what? The Prince of Peace. He's the one who's going to give them up. He's the one who's going to be the ruler in Israel. He's coming forth from days of old, from the ancient days. I mean, all of this is so prophetic in talking about Jesus. And it's talking about Jesus in the terms of a shepherd. It even talks about that he will shepherd them. You know, there's also language in these books when they talk about Assyria or other nations coming in. They say it'll almost be like a lion among the sheep. So back in those days, it's not common now in Israel, but in those days, you've heard lions and bears. David, was killing bears, ripping their jaws apart with his hands and killing lions. They had an abundance of lions and bears back then. They were constantly, so when they used that imagery, it was very common. So he used that imagery to say they're going to come among the sheep and slaughter them. If a lion got let loose without a shepherd in the sleep, it's a slaughter. I mean, it's a slaughter. They'd tear them to pieces. But the flip side is if you have a shepherd who lovingly watches over the flock to the extent that Jesus says in the New Testament, in fact, here's how interested I am in you as an individual. If one of them, of 100, gets lost, I'm going to go get them. I'm going to keep the other 99 safe, make sure they're okay while I'm gone, but I'm going to go get them. And when I get them and they're rescued, there's going to be a celebration of the angels in heaven. That's the kind of shepherd we serve. And it made me think about, in Luke 11, the story of Lazarus. You know, Jesus grew up in and around, apparently, and had been friends for a long time with Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus, and was very, very close to them. And he was 2 or 3 days' worth away from where they lived. Mary and Martha sent word to him that said, Lazarus is deathly ill. And this apparently was an illness he'd come down with really quickly. It's not like he'd been ill for a long time and now he was just kind of getting to his last days. This was something that struck overnight. They sent word and they said, we know you can do something about this. Would you please come? And he gets the word, and it said he remained where he was 2 more days, which always kind of been like, wow. You know, if you heard that your best friend's, you know, a brother was dying and you were close with him, you'd think you'd be like, let me drop everything I'm doing. He hadn't finished his ministry there. Plus, he knew it was coming. So he gets there, and by the time he gets there, Lazarus is dead. He's been in a tomb several days. And Jesus already knows what's going to happen. But the I think two coolest words, and when I was a kid, we used to joke about this. What's your favorite verse in the Bible? The only one I could remember was Jesus wept, because it's 2 words. But it's 2 of the most beautiful words in the Bible, because we have a God, we have a Lord who weeps with us. I find that amazing. You know, all of the man-made gods, whether it's Buddha, whether it's Confucius, you know, whether it's Allah, you know, whether it's, you know, the Greek gods, whatever, they're always pictured as dominant, overbearing, vicious, tyrants. But I'll tell you, the last thing they do is weep with someone, especially a slave or a bondservant, like we heard in the service this morning. But he weeps with us. So if he weeps with us and for us, it means that when we're joyful and celebrating, that he's celebrating too. So this is a God that if you, he weeps with us, and he weeps with us when we're brokenhearted. He celebrates with us. But I think about the fact that Jesus knew he was going to raise Lazarus, and yet he cared enough for what the sorrow going around him, and the fact that this was a result of sin, because death was entered in because of sin, that he wept. He wept. He weeps with us. So wherever we are in life, if your heart's been broken, if you've come to the end of your, you know, of your rope, he weeps, and yet he's meeting you there. I just find that astounding, and we see that back here. It's so much easier to pick it out and identify it in the New Testament because it's so graphic. You know, he weeps, and then he proceeds to bring Lazarus out of the tomb. That's the God we serve. He has that power, but he has that empathy. He has that kind of mercy, but then he has the grace to weep. And so I just find that fascinating, but you can find it here in the Old Testament too, if you'll look for it. So as we segue over to chapter 6, we're going to see a passage here that's also pretty famous, because in essence, it summarizes what it looks like to be a Christian. And it summarizes what it looks like a heart of Christianity looks like, and what obedience as a result of that heart change looks like. But the question I have for you is, if you could get Jesus anything for Christmas. Now, we just talked about a Jesus that weeps with us. We talked about a Jesus coming out of Bethlehem to rise up and to rule over all the nations. And we could go into the minutia of that passage. Part of it is looking ahead to his second coming. That's the part that it talks about he's going to put it off like a mother in birth pains and bring it all back together. That's talking about bringing Israel back together at the end. But regardless, this is the Jesus we serve. And for Christmas, what would you get him? What would you get Jesus for Christmas?
All he wants is your heart.
Mm.
Our obedience.
Heart, obedience,
Glory and praise.
glory and praise. Yeah, he's going to tell us right here. And by the way, that's it. You're exactly right. But as we read these verses, first of all, the first part of these verses, and it's chapter 6, by the way, verse 6. We're going to look at 6 through 8, just a tiny passage. The first part, though, is what not to give him. And yet it's what most people do give him. So it says, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Middle of verse 6. Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? So what is he talking about there? Because the question's asked, what should I come to the Lord Most High with? In other words, what am I bringing Jesus for Christmas? Sacrifices, work, efforts, pictures, stage show, appearances. So he starts off with the idea, shall I come with calves a year old? Calves a year old, first of all, were the prime sacrificing object. Now you had bulls and you had rams and you had other things, and they did serve different purposes. But if you wanted to give God the best you had in terms of the quality of your sacrifice, it was a year-old calf. So he's saying, should I come with calves? They're saying, that should I come with calves? By the way, remember I talked about these people are not different from us in 9/11? One of the things when I talked about them pumping the brakes and getting their act together for a little while is they bring year-old calves. See, even when they were sacrificing before, they were bringing the worst livestock they had. But now they're saying, no, we're going to get it together. We're going to bring in the best we have. So we're going to bring them a year-old calf. There's the quality of the sacrifice. People think that what if I just give him my best and I do my best and I'm teaching this and I'm discipling that and I'm going here and I'm serving there. And by the way, that's given me a good standing with God because I'm earning points. Even if you don't acknowledge it with your lips, you feel it in your heart. So the first is the quality of the sacrifice, but the second, or will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Well, that's the quantity of the sacrifice. In other words, what if I just do more? Did you know more ministers burn out because of the quantity of the effort they're putting in? And they lose sight of the relationship because they're so interested in the ministry or so focused on the ministry, or they get so distracted with the ministry. And what they're doing is critical, no doubt. Obviously, they're ministers. But they lose focus, and it becomes this quantity of sacrifices for Jesus rather than what we're getting to, which is exactly right, is praise, glory, heart, obedience. And so finally then he actually goes and says, well, what about the ultimate sacrifice? What if I give my children? It says, or shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? They were doing this. They were offering their children sacrificially. They're burning their children alive to appease gods. And they got that all from Assyria and from the Philistines and from the Egyptians, primarily from the Assyrians, though. And now they're literally saying, should we do that? Would that make you happy? In other words, what are we doing to make you happy? That goes back to the phrase, am I more interested in making God comfortable for me, or am I more interested in changing so I'm a little more comfortable with God in His eyes? And so, see, this is all not just works-oriented, but it's about trying to win approval, trying to win brownie points. And listen, if you've been saved and you understand your salvation and your security in your salvation, and yet if you're like me, I'm still trying to earn brownie points, not because I think it's going to earn me salvation. I've gotten past that in my walk, to be honest with you. I get it. But I'll tell you what, there's still a part of me, because we're wired for this. We're wired for productivity and activity and approval. We're wired for it and we're begging for it. That says if I'm trying to get that from my wife, from my friends, from my coworkers, I want their respect, I want them to think I'm doing great. Why wouldn't I do the same for God? I won't say it in Sunday school because I know it's the wrong answer, but I'm still trying to do it. So those are the wrong answers.
Not only that, they're not repentant. They're just sorry they got caught.
That's right.
They know what it takes to restore that so that they can keep on sinning.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was interesting. and how an insult it is to think God would want them to give them their firstborn. That's like so rude. I mean, I think you're asking God, so what do you want? Our babies? Like the God they know would never ask them to do that. So this apology or this whatever they're trying to do is just so I don't know what I'm trying to say, unauthentic. And
So let me again give a stark picture of that. The Sunday after 9/11, so 9/11, I guess 9/16, maybe 17, in this church, packed to the rafters. They have to bring seats in, obviously. No shocker there. And people standing up. At the end of the service, we gave people a time to come down to the altar and just have a time of prayer. The altar not only was full, there were nobody in the seats. The entire congregation got up and came down to the altar. And 4 weeks later, we were back to about half full. That's what that looks like right there is, oh, I'm going to the altar. And it sounds like I'm being harsh. I'm when I went down. I mean, I can look at my own life and say, well, how intent were you? But I mean, it took 4 weeks before the altar was not a consideration. Neither was even coming to God's house to worship. That's exactly what's going on here. So then he flips the script and he says, you want to give Jesus a gift for Christmas? Here's one. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? In other words, what does he want from you? And you're right, it's embodied in the three things that he says: praise, grace, obedience, your heart. He says he wants you to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Now that sounds like a, well, duh, and very easy. Do justice. Well, just do what's right, you know. Be merciful. All right, don't crush everybody. Maybe forgive somebody once in a while. And walk humbly with God. Okay, well, yeah, I'm not arrogant, so, you know, conversely, I'm automatically almost ought to be humble. Well, here's what it means to do justice. Justice is, first of all, God's just. He's not fair, so it has nothing to do with fairness. But justice, here's what justice is. It's treating people right because you know Almighty God. And so truly, from a biblical standpoint, you can't do people justice or do God justice if you don't know Him. And yet, what do we hear in our world? Social justice. Social justice. See, that's more about being fair in someone's eyes. That's more about giving people things, you know, that we feel bad about, reparations, you know, just giving whatever, you know, but we're doing social justice. But that's not really the definition of justice. At least it's not God's definition. When he says mercy, this is a term that's actually called, the Hebrew term is hesed, and it's used all the time in the Old Testament to describe God. When we use the word merciful in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, generally it's translated as that word hesed, and it means patient love. It means, it's translated, literally means His mercy endures forever. That's a song. His mercy is love, His mercy endures forever. And it's doing unto others as God has done unto you. That's what it means to be merciful. Now, granted, Scripture says, do unto others as you would have them do to you. But right before it says, love the Lord God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. So what that means is, when you're merciful, you're doing unto others as God has done unto you. So has He blessed you? Well then, should you bless others? Has He lifted you up when you were struggling? Yes. Could we all agree that's yes? So should we lift others up when they're struggling? Yes. Those two sound like no-brainers, like, well, yeah. Here's the biggie, though. Has He forgiven you? Again, a resounding yes. So should we forgive others? Yeah, it's not an option. In fact, Jesus goes as far as to say, listen, if you're not forgiving people, I'm not forgiving you. He uses the same kind of analogy and language when he says, if you won't confess me before men, you're crazy if you think I'm confessing you before my Father. If you don't have the guts to do what's right in front of men on my behalf here, then in eternity, when I'm before a holy Father, my holy Father, do you think I'm going to confess you who disrespected me and disregarded me to that extent? It's the same with forgiveness. So it's what God has done unto you. We convert it into what other people have done to us. And that's what makes it so difficult to forgive them or even to bless them. Because, let's just be honest, they don't deserve it. Even if they really haven't done anything to me, they've done things to other people, and they stand for this, and they look like that, and whatever the case may be. So I'm just going to, how about sin is also withholding the blessing? That's a sin of omission. I may not be sinning against them, but I'm not blessing them, and that's a sin of omission. And then, humility. There's a lot of definitions of humility, but I like this one because it says the opposite about pride. Having a right view of yourself because you have a right view of God. That's humility when it says walk humbly with your God. By the way, that looks like praise and glory. But all of these, obedience, walk humbly, that's actually an obedient thing. You're walking humbly. Being merciful, that's a heart issue. Showing justice, that's both. So it's all of these things encompassed, but that is literally what the Christian life looks like. Now, it's many other things, and in the New Testament, just like the Old Testament, God and Jesus go to length to tell us what not to do. I love that. But it also tells us what to do, and God, when that happens, keeps it simple. I mean, the entire book of Leviticus is really about what not to do. But when God gets it to what to do, He keeps it very, very simple. Here it just says, act justly, be merciful, and walk humbly with me. That's not a lot to it's hard to do, but it's not a lot to bite off. You know what he says his will is for you in 1 Thessalonians 5:16 through 18?
Rejoice always.
He says, rejoice always.
Pray continually.
Pray continually.
Give thanks in all circumstances.
And give thanks in all circumstances. Why?
For this is the will of God through Christ Jesus for you.
That's right. Now, again, I can be flippant. We all want to know God's will for our life. A couple of the young men I took home last night, when we got into a conversation about what God's will is for my life. Because he said, this is what I'm doing now. And what he's doing is good. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But he said, I don't really like doing this, and I can't see myself doing this the rest of my life. And I wish the Lord would show me what he wants me to do. And I said, well, pray. And I said, he's not hiding in the bushes with his will. He wants you to know. It's not a puzzle you have to figure out. It doesn't mean it's going to be crystal clear right away, but he's gone before you. He's prepared that for you. But that's what it looks like, the will. To rejoice always, to be joyful always. That's different from happiness. We've talked about that. Different. God's not calling us to happiness. He's calling us to holiness. And holiness looks like joy. I have joy regardless of circumstances, as much as my heart may be crushed and broken because of the peace I have that I will see him again and that I will live forever with the only one who loves me more than anybody else. That's peace and that's joy. So he says, be joyful always, regardless of your circumstances. Then he says, pray constantly. We talk about this all the time. What if Lynn and I were walking around together for 4 hours? We stood next to each other, walked. We never made eye contact. We never held hands. When we finally sat down to eat, all we did was look at our phones, never said a word to each other. Would y'all think we were that interested in each other? Or would you think we're probably interested more in our tablet or our phone than really what's the person sitting across from me? That's what it means to pray constantly. It just means to be in communion, to be in conversation all the time. It doesn't mean hitting your knees or bowing your head or folding your hands. It means I'm constantly in conversation with the Lord. And then finally, here we are, Thanksgiving, on the cusp of Thanksgiving, and it says to give thanks regardless of your circumstances. So I was in Charlotte this week, and we had 2 speakers at this meeting I was at. The one guy, it was a weird combination. He graduated from Harvard. He was the focus of an entire show with Oprah. Remember she'd do those one-off shows where she'd fly people out to her ranch, spend an hour talking to them? He was one of these people. His resume was stunning, sterling. He graduated from Harvard, then he's got his PhD, hear this, in Christian and Buddhist ethics. So I was like, I wanted to catch him afterwards and say, how do those two... and is it just about being ethical? So his talk was how to be happy and how to be productive. And, but I'll tell you this, he said something that may have changed my life. Gary Smalley said back in '94 when I got saved at a Promise Keepers conference, he said, hey guys, how many of you have got trouble in your marriage? And about 2/3 of the hands went up. And he said, well, he goes, I got a quick fix for you. He said, now you may still need counseling, you may need medication, and you certainly need to get right with the Lord. He said, but if you'll go home for 30 days and outserve your wife without making a big deal of it, just go home, change the diapers, do the clothes, empty the dishwasher, things you're probably not doing right now. He goes, it will start to change the fabric and basically the wiring of your marriage. And it did for ours. It did. It didn't make everything perfect, but it changed the wiring. He said, this guy is a big neurotransmitter. He's a big, chemical imbalance guy, all of that. He said, if you want to change your view of the world, he said, here's what you do. You journal every day. And when he said that, I was like, oh gosh, I can't journal. I can't focus. He said, no. He said, here's what I want you to do. He said, every day when you get up, or sometime during the day, write down 3 things you're grateful for. He said, but the next day, you're going to write down 3 different things. And the next day, they're going to be 3 different things. And the next day, they're going to be 3 different things. He said, after 30 days, what has happened is your brain has had to think so hard about the things you're thankful for. Because he said the first 10 days, 2 weeks, pretty easy. Love Jesus, love my wife, love fill in the blank, love this. He said, but it's amazing the way we're wired in this world. After about 2 weeks, we start running out of stuff. And we start either making stuff up or looking at, tiny things like, I'm grateful I have this nightstand, He said, no. Force yourself to continue to say, he goes, after 30 days, you've got 90 original differentiated things you're thankful for. And he said, you know what's happened to your brain? You've gone from, I'm just trying to find things to be thankful for, like at Thanksgiving, when it's just the week to be thankful, to all of a sudden you're starting to see life as I'm looking for things to be thankful for, because I had to do it for 30 days. I had to look and find and write down things. Now that after 30 days, I'm going to look back and see 90 things. Boom, 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 boom. He said, literally, it'll change the wiring in your brain to go from just, I'm trying to survive and be thankful, to now I am actively, I may not consciously be seeking out, but subconsciously, I'm constantly sweeping for what to be thankful for. And now instead of yipping and yapping, and I don't know why this happened, and I don't know why this ain't fair, and I don't know why I got passed over for this, and this got treated this way. Now all of a sudden, everything's a blessing. And I thought, what about that in the context of our relationship with Christ? So here's a real life wiring opportunity to change, but mix it in with the love we have for the Lord, the grace we've been shown, and the gift we've been given. And I would think for us, especially when we think about what's been done for us, that it would take our level of gratitude through the roof, and that we'd never be the same. So I'm doing it. I'll let you know how it turns out. If you want me to be the guinea pig, I'll do that, and we'll see after 30 days. But it's a pretty easy thing. If you're like me, at least especially for most men, I just want to get to the bottom line. And that's the reason when he said journal, I was like, you lost me. But no, I can do 3 things. And right now it is easy. But I can see a day when it's going to be coming, when I'm going to be like, oh, okay, what am I really thankful for today? So as you go about this week, maybe you'll take that into consideration and begin to do that. That's a pretty simple thing to do, at least to start with. But listen, one of the things we're most grateful for and thankful for is our fellowship here, the privilege we have together. Let's don't ever take this for granted for a lot of different reasons. And we're just thankful to have the privilege of sharpening and being sharpened and walking through life and holding each other accountable and weeping with each other and celebrating with each other and doing exactly what Jesus does with us, because that's what he's asked to do. So I hope y'all have a blessed week. We love and appreciate y'all, and I hope you have an especially blessed Thanksgiving. But let's be thankful 365, okay? Jeff, do you mind closing us, buddy? Amen. Hey, thank you, buddy.